Welcome, everyone, to Docked Out. This is Steve Ward, your host. You can find me on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Search for Docked Out Official. And I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to chat in any questions or comments, and I'll be happy to answer those towards the end of the broadcast. So, welcome. Good to have you all. So I'd like to continue tonight discussing LGBTQIA ideology. And over the past few broadcasts, I've focused in a little bit on the genetics of intersex, as well as some of the postmodernism and progressive ideas that have crept into the culture that have led us down this path of transgenderism. And have started to address some of the questions of whether it's possible, biologically speaking, to change your gender. But my goal tonight is to explain a little bit more of the science, a little bit more of the genetic syndromes involved in what we call differences in sex development, or DSDs. These are the intersex patients. Now, these are very rare genetic conditions, but they're often used to promote LGBTQIA ideology in the sense that they're used as examples that there are multiple genders other than male or female. They can also be used as examples to promote this idea of gender fluidity. But I want to highlight for you that these are medical conditions, these are syndromes that can actually be very serious in a lot of cases, sometimes even life threatening. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But there are significant metabolic disorders, hormone disorders, and even cancers that can creep in to some patients that have these DSDs, as we say. So I'd like to explain that some more and help you understand that patients that have these intersex conditions, in the vast majority of cases, are still distinctly male or female. They're so-called exceptions to the rule of the binary, but not new genders. So I want to help you with that distinction. We can assign gender at birth to a newborn in the vast majority of cases. So for tonight, I have four particular audiences in mind. So young people who may be part of the LGBTQIA community, who have questions, who have concerns, or are trying to learn a different perspective. And also young people who are unsure about whether or not it's possible to transition, or maybe they need help understanding what gender really is. How do we define that? I also want to try to help pastors and church leaders who don't feel equipped to answer some of these questions from a biologic or genetics basis. So, a little bit of some educational goals to try to help us as a church explain and minister to people who may have intersex conditions, or people who aren't really sure what to make of all of this. And I'd also like to help church members who really just don't know what to say to somebody who might be struggling with this. And we need a compassionate, thorough understanding of the issue. So in the media and in the culture, we hear a lot about evidence that says that transgenderism is not biologically based and so forth. But what I really have not heard is the actual science itself, and some of uh, the references or the journal articles that are being used to promote transgender ideology. We're not hearing a lot of those details. So I'm trying to fill that gap for you tonight, and just edify us from that standpoint. We have to do this. I mean, there are more complications coming. There are many advances on the horizon in terms of reproductive technology. There's even the possibility of uterine transplants into men, so men could carry a pregnancy in a transplanted uterus. All of these things are becoming more and more scientifically possible to do, and we might see them. And people who are familiar with these things, or maybe participating in some of these things, coming into the church. And we need to be able to reach them and have meaningful conversations and relationships with them. So, we're going to explore a little bit more about what determines gender. And let me pause here for a moment. So, think about this with me. If a woman has breast cancer and has mastectomies as part of her treatment for breast cancer, does that mean she's not a woman anymore? Or what about a woman who has uterine cancer, endometrial cancer, cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, fibroids, menorrhagia? The list is long, indications why somebody might have a hysterectomy. So, does a woman who has a hysterectomy, does that mean she's no longer a woman? Or what about a man that has testicular cancer or other conditions that require orchiectomies or castration? Okay, not trying to be too inappropriate or graphic, but seriously, I mean, or what about people who are infertile? Does that mean that they are not a biologic man or a woman anymore? So we have to be very careful about definitions, and also to say, broadly speaking, that every man or woman would be XX or XY, whatever the case might be. That can be a little tricky when it comes to some of these intersex patients that have well described differences in sex development, or DSDs. So we'll get into that a little bit more. I want you to know that the health system at large and the culture at large is saying that patients that have these DSDs will choose or can choose their gender identity later. But I disagree with that, and I'll share the reasons why throughout this evening's broadcast. I'm going to give you the evidence and some literature that describes what happens to people if they are misgendered at birth. We have some of that information, and we know that incorrectly assigning sex at birth does lead to that child growing into adulthood having dissatisfaction and complications and problems, and sometimes those people will want to uh, change back to their original biologic gender that they should have been given at birth in the first place. That's a very different situation than somebody who is biologically normal, who is choosing to identify as a different gender later in life for some other reason. So we have to keep those issues very separate. They are separate. In the Journal of Sexual Medicine, 2018, there was a publication, a survey performed in the European Union of over 1,000 patients with differences in sex development. And did you know that only 1% of them changed their gender identity after puberty? Only 1%. That's very small of a subset of a very small community of individuals that have these genetic disorders. Now, fortunately, in modern science today, we have the benefit of an incredible amount of research that is now at our fingertips that allows us to understand these genetic conditions more, the transcription of DNA, all of the apparatus that is involved in cellular metabolism. And this is an awesome place to be. One of the things that we have learned that you probably haven't heard about is that healthy baby boys have an androgen surge from the time of birth up to about 3 months. So, androgens, those are hormones that will virilize or make the child further develop as a boy and ultimately as a man. But the important thing to know is that there are cognitive changes and neurologic hardwiring that takes place during that time period of this androgen surge that leads that child to play and have behaviors of play that are unique to boys. This was published in 2015, came out of the Department of Pediatrics in Cambridge in the journal Hormone Behavior. But we don't hear much about that. So your mind, or your brain, I should say, is hardwired genetically at conception, but also very early after birth. All of those changes are made more permanently embedded in the structure and the neurologic connections of your brain. So here are a few other things that maybe you didn't know. So in differences of sex development, the long-term surgical outcomes, if a patient has surgery, those outcomes are completely unknown. So we don't know how some of these people will do over time into adulthood and later in life. And I would argue that as a result of that, we really should not be performing surgical changes except in rare circumstances and when only properly indicated, but certainly not for people that are biologically normal but are choosing to change their gender identity later because of an ideology that is pushing them to do so. And I say that with compassion because I understand that there are many complex reasons why a person might be moving in the direction of a gender transition or having a different gender identity. So I get that, but I just want to make the point that I think we just have to be very careful because we do not have long-term outcome data for patients who undergo surgical changes. We just don't, no matter what you might hear in the culture or in the media or even coming out of the healthcare establishment. We just do not. In fact, Germany has banned irreversible surgeries without informed consent. And that's because of high complication rates and poor outcomes in terms of sexual function as well as urinary problems. There's sometimes very complex repair that gets done to the pelvic floor, complicated surgeries, and we don't know how these people do. And sometimes or often we see that these patients really do poorly with a lot of complications. But notice that it's not really even possible to provide informed consent to a procedure such as this. And the reason is that giving consent means that you understand the risks and the benefits and that you've weighed those things and you're making a decision one way or the other. But without knowing the outcome data or how people do over time, it's really impossible to provide that type of consent in the first place. In the journal Nature Reviews Endocrinology in 2018, this is talking about patients that have differences in sex development. The authors come out very openly and say that there really is not a psychologically based counseling program or support system that is in place for this population of patients. There are surgeries available for some rare cases, but otherwise, there really is no formal structure for these patients suffering from these conditions to have the psychological and emotional support and spiritual support that they really need. That to me is like a huge ministry opportunity right there. We also don't have long term outcome data about hormone therapies when hormones are given to patients that are intersex, we don't know how they do over time in terms of their neurocognitive effects and memory changes and cognition changes as people get older and go into their more elderly years. We just don't know those things, which to me is a red flag that, hey, we need to just slow down and study this out and be able to provide substantial data and evidence before going in this direction. The authors of this particular article also very openly said that children will do better, emotionally, psychologically speaking, with their difference in sex development condition if they're told early about their condition. And that just makes sense. The more people understand about what's going on, the better they do, the better chance that they have of adapting and overcoming and so forth. And I think to teach people that in the broken human condition, we're all born with abnormalities and frailties. People are born with a whole wide range of genetic conditions, not just ones affecting sexual maturation or gender issues, really anything. This is what it means to be human. We are broken people from the fall. We have mortality. So I think it's a proper message to let people know that this is just what happens sometimes to some people living in a fallen world. That's a much healthier message, I would argue, than letting people uh, get older, but not really educating them adequately. And then as they have distress, what's happening is we're saying, well, we need new categories of describing these different conditions. So we're going to call them different genders, and we'll say that gender is fluid, when that's not actually the case. What we need is just a more honest and open and spiritually minded understanding of what is going on. So these things that I've mentioned to you, I just want you to understand that the media and the general culture is not educating people in this direction. And that's just a really key thing to understand. We need to do that. So, what is the role of the church in all of this? Well, the church, and for Christians who are going about their day, our goal is to be salt and light, to stand for the truth, to love people, to share the gospel, and so forth. And there are ways to do that. And I would say we first have to till up the soil, so to speak, of another person's heart and prepare them for the seed planting of the message of the truth. And we come alongside them and we water those seeds. And of course, God gives the increase and does the spiritual work and prepares hearts unto salvation. But we need to participate in this. And I'm hoping that we can be part of that through an educational process, but also just plain in relationship building with compassion, with understanding where people are at and meeting them where they are at. That is just so critical. So when it comes to LGBTQIA issues, this idea that we can be gender free, there are no genders, gender is fluid, this can actually mistakenly, if we're not careful, push people who are struggling towards progressive churches. Remember that we're engaging in spiritual warfare, and we have a satanic attack on our identity as made in the image of God, created by God in his image. Now, we're all broken by sin. And I would say that the church has not always handled LGBTQIA issues well. And we have to approach individuals in this community or people who are struggling with this compassionately to make them feel welcomed. Now, let me ask you just a general rhetorical question. Have you had an LGBTQIA visitor or people come to your church asking sincere questions or wanting to get to know you? Or do you have strong enough relationships with people in that community such that they would call you, talk to you, ask you questions, pick your brain about what you think about this from a Christian standpoint? And if not, why is that? Why not? Now, we all want to be ourselves, be loved, be welcomed, be respected. And we hear that during Pride Month. We hear that in the media and coming from people in the LGBT community. That's what they want. But honestly, that's what we all want, right? We all want to be accepted, and that's a good thing. But in order to love people, we have to speak truth with compassion and warmth, meeting them wherever they are. Understanding that sometimes people who are in the LGBTQIA community, there's cultural pressure, there's biologic confusion, there's parents don't know what to do. There might be a trauma history. I mean, it's very complicated. So we don't need to get into all of that tonight, but I just want to suffice it to say that we need to just be very delicate about how we handle these issues to be loving like Christ. So here's the big question. So did God make a mistake and put some people in the wrong body? So you might hear this asked. Okay, so it's an interesting question, but I want to unravel it a little bit more because there are lots of assumptions that are baked into the question itself. I picked out 7 actually. So I'll just list them for you real quick. Okay, so to ask that question, you have to make a number of assumptions. First, you have to assume that God exists in the first place, that God created us, There's an assumption that it's possible for God to make a mistake. There's an assumption that God determines what gender he wants you to be. So therefore, God would be gender specific in his creative intent towards you. There's also an assumption that your spirit has a gender as well as your body, or your mind has a gender as well as your body, and sometimes they're discordant. And then there's an assumption that you might feel like a different gender later in life. And there's an assumption that those feelings are reliable, right? All of those things are embedded in the question. So I want to help you start thinking in that direction, that in order to really address some of the questions that you might hear, you've got to unwrap them and get through each of those issues one by one. So here's an important comment I want to make. We're changing language and we're softening terms. So, for example, it's really no longer PC to say that somebody is born with a disorder in sexual development or a disease in sexual development. We call it a difference. And by calling these disorders differences, that opens the door to this ideology that, well, this is just a spectrum of normal and we need to create new gender categories. Otherwise, we might hurt somebody's feelings by telling them that they have a disease or some type of abnormality. That type of language is considered too strong today in a progressive culture that lives according to subjective truths, or basically feelings. We don't want to hurt feelings. But remember, here's a verse in Jeremiah 1:5, and here's another one in Jeremiah 17. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Our feelings are unreliable. And here in Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Okay, so before I formed thee in the belly, so God is doing this creative activity, creating you in the womb. But God knew you and understood who you are and desired to create you well before that. And that is such a powerful truth. I really want to, delve into this for a couple of minutes tonight and talk more about identity and where that comes from in the Christian worldview. So let's jump into that for a few minutes. So we are created in the image of God, mind, body, and spirit. Created, and God knowing you before he performed the creative act. And here in Psalm 139:14, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. Okay, so this doesn't sound like a God who made a mistake. To be fearfully and wonderfully made and marvelous, that doesn't mean that you might not have a genetic defect, as your body in a fallen condition is born with a particular disease or a problem. You are still fearfully and wonderfully made. So let's keep that in mind. So, this idea that our identity has multiple facets to it. So you've heard this in the Christian worldview or in church, perhaps, that we are justified. But what does that really mean? So to be justified has two or three major components. So we are redeemed, meaning that we are forgiven of our sin. So we have this sin debt that is zeroed out, so to speak, by the atonement of Christ on the cross. But in addition, we are given the righteousness of Jesus. But in addition to that, we are adopted. So God justifies us and adopts us, meaning he chooses us. And here is a verse in Ephesians 1:4 to drive that home. According as he hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love. God knows our failures, past, present, and future, but he adopted and chose you anyway. There's no fear of rejection in that. God's love towards you is guaranteed. There's no condemnation, and there is nothing that you can do to earn the love of God. In Romans 8:1, we say there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. We can be seated with Jesus, seated in our justification and in our adoption, and rest in Christ. There's no need to earn favor from God or from anyone else, or to prove anything to yourself, to others, or to God. God has accepted you already for who you are. And that's so key as we understand our identity in Christ. All right, let's transition here a little bit. Let's move into some of these genetic syndromes. I want to give you a few of them and hit some highlights, okay? So let's talk about 46XX DSDs. And what I mean by that is, these are individuals with 46 chromosomes, okay, 23 pairs. These are XX chromosomes. Now, typically that would be a female, right? But these are people that are born with differences in sex development. There are several to highlight. I'll kind of run through them quickly and give you the more important ones to be aware of. Now, many of these involve disorders of the adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland is seated above the kidneys, and they are metabolically quite active. And we can measure the hormones that the adrenal gland releases. There are many tests that we can do that are helpful to help us understand what particular condition is at hand, okay? So in the adrenal gland, we have the activity of ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropin hormone, released by the pituitary gland. Okay, so the pituitary is in your brain. It stimulates your adrenal gland to do three particular things. One is to make androgens. Those are the precursors to the virilizing hormones. Also to make steroids, glucocorticoids, or basically cortisol, and also mineralocorticoids. And the one of note in that category is called aldosterone. That has important metabolic implications and functions, and also helps regulate blood pressure and does some other things. So your adrenal gland is very metabolically active in this particular way. There are three regions of your adrenal gland. They all do different things from an endocrinologic type of a standpoint. So because of these complicated pathways, there are many things that can actually go wrong genetically speaking. So one of them is a DSD called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Okay, so this is due to 21 hydroxylase deficiency. That's an enzyme that converts some precursors of cortisol and aldosterone into cortisol and aldosterone. If that is deficient, then you're not going to produce those things. Instead, you're only going to produce the androgens. Now, you're going to sense very low blood levels of the cortisol and aldosterone. So you're going to upregulate or make more of the ACTH in order to stimulate, to try to compensate and overstimulate and make more and more, try to get the process going. But it's not going to work. All that's going to do is just stimulate your adrenal gland to make more and more androgens, which will virilize the individual. Now, these are girls. That's really important to understand. These are XX girls. They have ovaries, they have a uterus, but they might be more viralized in terms of some of their other features in their sex organs at birth to varying degrees. Now, in very severe cases, you could do some corrective surgery to the female structures to make them, improve function and whatnot. But I just want you to know that a surgical procedure like that is not trying to change the gender. It's trying to correct an abnormality in the sex development of the sex organs. Okay, so that's a very, very different scenario. Now, what's helpful to know about this particular condition is that with the lack of aldosterone, you can actually go into adrenal crisis, which can be life-threatening. So you would have low sodium levels, high potassium levels, low blood pressure. You can go into shock, and that can be fatal if not treated. So most newborns now are screened for this condition and are treated promptly for it because of the complications. So this is not a different gender. These are girls that have abnormalities in virilization, but these are girls. Now we do have evidence. We have studies that show, and I'll get into this a little bit more later. But when a girl with congenital adrenal hyperplasia is raised as a boy incorrectly, this will lead to that child growing older with dissatisfaction about their gender. And that doesn't mean that gender is fluid and that we can change gender. It means that there was an incorrect assignment at birth, which is a very different scenario. These are genetic girls. These are girls in every cell of their body, not just the sex organs. And if one of these girls is raised incorrectly as a boy, they would have to have surgery to remove the ovaries and uterus and have hysterectomies and all of these other issues that I feel would be unnecessary if they were properly understood to be genetic girls, which they are. And commonly, they are identified as such. So that's congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So there are two other syndromes worth mentioning. One is called glucocorticoid resistance. So this is where you have cortisol, but it basically doesn't work in your body's tissues. You have resistance to it. So your body doesn't sense the cortisol activity, and as a result, it upregulates the ACTH stimulation, which will then cause more androgens and more aldosterone to be formed. So you get virilization again of various degrees, but these are girls. Okay, it's not a different gender. These are girls. There is a condition called aromatase deficiency. These are also girls that have ovaries, and these ovaries would normally produce a small amount of testosterone. Okay, that's normal. But in this particular deficiency, aromatase is lacking, which is an enzyme which converts the androgens into estrogens. So if that process doesn't work, then your ratio of androgen to estrogen is going to be off. You're going to have a lower ratio of estrogen to androgens, and you're going to have some virilization as well. But these are still girls, not different genders. Okay, let's get into one more complicated condition, and then we'll move into XY. So this is important, okay? So try to grab a hold of this the best that you can. So ovotesticular DSDs. So basically, ovotesticular differences in sex development. This is very rare. This is what we used to call the hermaphrodite. That term is not in use anymore. They're called ovotesticular DSDs. These are very rare, occur in maybe 1 in 100,000. Okay, so there are a wide variety of genetic abnormalities, mutations that can activate testicular growth. Okay, so even though genetically these are XX, you can have part of the Y chromosome genetic material that translates over onto the X chromosome and stimulates male sexual development. So development of premature, immature testicles as well as immature ovaries. You can have a uterus, vas deferens, seminiferous tubules, if you're familiar with some of those terms anatomically, but basically you can have features of both genders. But this is very rare. This is like the one-off condition to be aware of. But here's the deal. So because of the differences in hormone production and development of the sexual structures, these individuals will tend to grow and develop as either male or female, never both at the same time. Because remember, the chromosomes are active in all of the tissues of the body, including the brain. And there's going to be predominantly female activity at the cellular level or predominantly male uh, activity at the cellular level. So the individual will develop in such a way. I think we need a lot more research in this area to understand how to better um, categorize and understand that development process. But this is one of those situations that we just have to understand is going to be different. But this does not mean that gender is fluid. These individuals will gravitate towards one or the other. So I know that's clear as mud, probably, but it is a real condition. It's not a third gender or gender fluidity, but we need to understand more. And the problem here is that these conditions can be so rare that we don't have high level scientific research to really teach us about how these individuals are developing and how this is working for them as they get older. So this is like a watch and wait scenario, but the child, as they grow through adolescence and into young adulthood, will manifest themselves as male or female. But we need to understand more. Very hard to study because of the rarity of the condition. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Um, okay, so shifting gears a little bit to the 46XY DSDs. So these are people that have 46 chromosomes, okay, 23 pairs, XY. So typically speaking, these would be boys. But I want to show you that that is not always how the development works in certain conditions. But we're not going to define new genders. These are further genetic abnormalities. So complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is something that you might hear thrown around a little bit. So this is where the child is born female, even though they have XY chromosomes, and that might sound odd, but the reason is that the androgens that are being produced are completely inactive. The child's body is completely insensitive to all of those virilizing stimulation. So there's no male development that actually happens, even though you have the XY chromosome. The Y chromosome, in effect, just doesn't work. It's not effective. So the child is born as a girl and lives and is raised and is a girl, is a female with normal female sex organs and so forth. Some individuals have reported uncertainty about their gender identity. But here's where the ideology comes in. So, an LGBTQIA activist will say, well, that means that we need new gender categories for intersex people such as this. But I would say that what this really means is that we need to better educate a young person with this condition to understand that they are female. Genetically, you can find XY chromosomes, but that's not active. So they are functionally speaking a female, and that's how we should raise them and care for them through this type of counseling that is based on the genetic realities of what's going on, rather than letting people be confused and then using that confusion in order to create new categories. There's another syndrome called partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. So previously was complete, this is partial. Now, similar to the over-testicular DSDs or the previously called hermaphrodite condition, this is another one that is a little tricky. where the degree of insensitivity to the androgens can be very variable. So this is also an area where we need more research. So there could be virtually no activity, which will mean your body develops as a female, or you could have near complete androgen activity. So you're a boy, you're a male, the way your cells and your body develop. There is no in between. You're going to be one or the other. So there's not a need for different categories. But what we do need in this case is another watch and wait type of approach and a way to really study out how this development, given this particular condition, is occurring. But one thing that helps is that you can give them testosterone and then you can watch and you can see how much response the person has to that testosterone, and that's going to give you an indication of that this is a boy that's testosterone sensitive, or it's not going to be sensitive, has no activity in that direction, and this is a girl. Okay, so that's how that could potentially work, but more research is needed. You know, another comment about children who are assigned a gender at birth incorrectly with some of these disorders, you can develop like a gender dysphoria, but that's because the biologic reality of the situation has not been fully understood or explored or explained, and we're replacing that with this incorrect psychology, if you will. But this is very different than somebody who is born with normal biologic physiology, but then later, because of a psychological desire or any number of complex things that occur in their life that lead them down that pathway of wanting to change their gender in terms of their of how they feel or the way they think of themselves. That's very, very different. And I think that draws a very stark contrast in between people that have genetic conditions and those that do not. The LGBTQIA community, in my opinion, has really hijacked the intersex population of people and used them to try to promote ideology that gender is fluid when that is not at all the case from a scientific standpoint. There's also a condition called androgen synthesis deficiencies. There are many, many enzymes involved, many genes involved. So these are boys, these are XY, where the testosterone, the amount of testosterone is lacking or is very low, or if there is a normal level, it's just not working. There's no testosterone activity. So the virilization of that boy will be partial, but they are still boys. Okay. They don't have a uterus or fallopian tubes or female sex structures. They have male sex structures, and these are boys. And again, when they are incorrectly assigned to to be a girl, to the feminine gender, they grow up with difficulty, and they'll often want to change back to identifying as a boy. But that's not transgenderism. That's correcting an error, and that's going back to their gender of birth that they are and should have been reared as all along. Very different than the ideology going on in the culture. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, there's one final condition to mention. So there is a 46XY DSD. It's called cloacal exstrophy. These are boys, and you can have some pretty severe genital abnormalities, mostly involving the pelvic floor. You can have a lot of urologic problems from this. Testosterone levels and sensitivity is normal, but sometimes these individuals have been assigned incorrectly as females, and that likewise causes dissatisfaction and distress through life. And then they correct course and um, understand themselves to be boys, which they are. But these patients usually have very complex surgeries and a lot of other issues going on as part of a larger syndrome. So a little bit of a separate issue. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about LGBTQIA activism, and a few things that they just don't really tell you about incorrectly assigning sex that is against your biology. The fact that this is actually harmful to you. So there was a survey came out in 2014, published in Psychology and Sexuality, where 75% of the patients that were surveyed that had a difference in sex development were fine. They were satisfied with their gender identity. About 25% said that they were unsure. And this was used by the authors to promote the idea that we need to create new gender categories. But I would say that this uncertainty is likely driven by a poor understanding of their diagnosis and a lack of the proper psychological and spiritual support especially through the early years of their life, through puberty and adolescence into young adulthood. There are many biases, and the authors actually were very transparent and made some statements that I found to be really revealing. So there was a statement in this journal that said, "Our central assumption is that a person's experience is likely in an atypical gender identity outside of binary categories." Okay, so focus in on that word assumption. So the authors, they performed this survey, they did this study, but they assumed that the experience was because these people are non-binary, they're other genders. So that was, I mean, it's a huge assumption, right? And actually, some individuals that were part of this study that said that they were dissatisfied, one in particular said that the reason they were confused and dissatisfied was because their healthcare system made them feel forced into transsexualism. Okay, so that to me was just very telling right there. There was a female that had the congenital adrenal hyperplasia that we talked about earlier that identified herself as third gender. And the reason she said was because she couldn't identify with the behavior of a classical woman. Okay, that to me, that's a cultural issue, that's a psychological issue where this person is not wanting to understand themselves as a woman because of what they perceive as perhaps male oppression, or in the feminist mindset where you have to stay home and take care of kids, you can't have a job or a career, and you're a homemaker, and all of those type of things that are spoken against in our society. This person didn't want to identify with being a classical woman, so she called herself third gender. Okay, that's psychologically based, that's not genetically based. There was a man too that felt like a female, or was more comfortable identifying as a female because and this person said, because society's role of a man is problematic. So also this is completely cultural, right? So this is the toxic masculinity. You don't want to be a man. You don't want to be more masculine because that is looked down upon for oppressing others, for white supremacy, or whatever the issue is. This particular individual has a different gender identity. So again, it's an example of a psychologically based decision that has a root in progressive ideology, progressive thinking, postmodernism, lots of stuff going on. It's very complicated, and it's hard to know what else might have been playing a role in those particular cases. But what I want to leave you with is simply the idea that we have to trust the truth, right? So we can trust the word of God. We know we are created in God's image. We know that our identity is secure. We are justified and adopted. We are spiritual beings. We live in a fallen world. Our bodies will have any number of a wide range of genetic defects and abnormalities and disease states. And it's okay to call them that because that's what they are. We don't need to soften the language to protect feelings. Now, of course, we should be sensitive to people's feelings. I'm all for that. But we don't want to hide the truth, because understanding our fallen condition as a result of sin is the first step in understanding our need for a savior, right? So this is a gospel critical issue that I hope we can get a little bit more understanding of tonight from what we've been talking about. All right, guys, you've listened to me ramble on for long enough. Let's take some questions or comments in the chat. We'll pull those up here momentarily. All right, Servant Slayer, greetings, Doc. Should hormonal disorders and so on, as you mentioned, be treated? And what are the treatments if they exist? Yeah, great question. So the answer is sometimes. And I don't mean to be vague, but congenital adrenal hyperplasia, for example, can be life threatening where you have adrenal insufficiency and shock. So those individuals are treated with steroids to replace the steroids that their adrenal gland is not able to produce on its own. And you also have to, consider aldosterone treatment as well for blood pressure and electrolyte control. So that type of research is out there, but primarily treated with two different types of steroids: mineralocorticoid, fluticort, as well as cortisol, in order to hit those two things that are lacking. So those people definitely. So other treatments would be like surgical treatments, which generally speaking, I don't feel are a good idea unless there are functional problems because of the risk of complications overall. But hormonal disorders, let's say if somebody has a legitimately low testosterone level and they need testosterone supplementation, that's okay. But we just need to understand that we're not changing their gender. We're just supplementing hormones or providing hormones to them that their body is not able to produce normally to maintain healthy, bone strength, muscle mass, neurocognitive development, and so forth for those healthy reasons, but we're not changing their gender. And that's where we differentiate LGBTQIA ideology, where we have somebody that does not have hormone abnormalities, um, but we give them high doses of testosterone or estrogen because we think we're changing their gender, which we're not. We're just giving them a drug, which is going to cause harm in many other ways. Puberty blockers, by the way, I think are very, very dangerous because puberty has a lot more to do with your overall systemic bodily development, head to toe, brain, heart, organs, everything, not just your sexual development. So to block puberty is going to block all of those things, which is really not what we should be doing, especially given that we're not able to change a person's gender anyway. It's just should not be done. Well, good question. Hopefully that helps. If you need to follow up, feel free to chat that in. All right, let's see what else we got in the chat. Any other questions? Happy to take those now. You can always feel free to visit the website, docdoubt.org. You can email me at steve@docdoubt.org, and I'm happy to write you back. All right. Looks like that is a wrap, guys. Well, thanks for coming and listening in. Really appreciate it. Click subscribe, share the content. I really want to try to get this out because I think more people need to understand some of the science and how some of the research is being somewhat twisted and manipulated in order to fit the agenda of an ideology. So let's try to get it out there. Appreciate it. And we'll talk to you guys next time. Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of the night.